afterwards. There we go, bang on cue. We are recording it. It will be available through the CSER website with captions. And there will also be an evaluation form will come your way afterwards. So if you have any comments, do please use that. The order of proceedings are that I will introduce our three speakers, who are Rick Davis, who needs no introduction to the evaluation world, and then Lara Manny and Tom Hobson for the Centre for Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. They're all going to speak for 15 minutes. Hopefully that'll leave us the best part of half an hour for Q&A. And the best way to run that is do try and frame questions and put them in the Q&A in text as we go along, so that we can then pick them out. And there is an option for uplisting other people's questions, which means that we will get to questions that other people endorse more rapidly. So I think that covers the housekeeping. I don't have to tell you where the fire exits are. Mine's just behind me. And so what I will do is pass you on to Rick to introduce the session.
Thanks, James. I'll just put up a slide showing the order of speaking and what we're going to be talking about, if I can manage to do that. So here we are. Basically, I'll be talking very briefly, well, for 15 minutes on how a web application called ParEvo.org will help us explore alternative futures. And then I'll be followed by Tom, who will be talking about how ParEvo was used by him and Lara, who are both working in the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk here in Cambridge. And then Lara will follow with a discussion about how ParEvo compares to other methods of exploring alternative futures. And then James will take over to facilitate a discussion. And now let me proceed with the main presentation. Okay, thank you to everyone for coming along. So I'm going to be giving an overview on how the ParEvo process works, along with some examples.
Sorry to interrupt, Rick. Yes. I can't see your slides yet. I don't know if anybody else can.
Beg your pardon. Sorry, my failure.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so if you can put that in display.
Okay,
perfect.
Sorry for that. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about ParEvo and how it works, and well, along with some examples of analysis of data that is generated by the process. This is the page that you will see on the web when you log onto the site ParEvo.org. And in this slide, I have a graphic diagram which I use to explain how the process works in its core features. What you see on the right in this diagram, all the nodes, the circles, represent paragraphs of text. And you'll see that each of those paragraphs of text are connected by lines that can be seen as branches. And so a branch represents a storyline, a sequence of paragraphs of text telling what happens in consecutive or in order, like when you're reading a book. So the ParEvo process starts with a seed text, like the front page of a book. And then in the first iteration, which is this first column from the left, there are 10 participants who each decide to add an extra paragraph to that seed paragraph saying what happens next. So we've effectively got 10 different versions of what happens next. When they do that, which is done anonymously, at the end of that process, everybody is allowed to see what everybody else has written. And then we move to the next iteration, where those same participants are given the choice of adding to one and only one of those branches that have now developed. And you'll see in this diagram that in some cases, some of the original branches nobody added to, and down the bottom, some of the original branches more than one person has added to them. When that happens, when everybody has done that, everybody again can see what everybody else has written. And then we move on to the next iteration, which is the next column, where people can then add another paragraph to the storylines that they're now reading. As this process goes on, some storylines die out, nobody extends them. Some storylines survive and proliferate and diversify into multiple different branches. This process continues for as many iterations as the facilitator who's designed the process wants to happen. So let me move on. That's the core of the process. What you see now is the web interface that a user will see. At the top of this interface, you'll see the title of the exercise. In this case, it was called Alternative Futures for the USA 2020 Plus. And at the top there, the facilitator provides guidance to the participants about what they're expected to do in the current iteration. And then you can scroll down to see the details of that when you're viewing it as a user. On the left-hand side, you'll see another tree diagram, but a much more complex one, because this has involved about 11 participants, and it took place over about 8 or 9 iterations. And you'll see on the left-hand side, one of those branches is highlighted in green, and that's because when you click on one of the nodes, that branch will be highlighted, and it will then display the text of that storyline on the right-hand side. So that body of text you can see on the right-hand side is the branch you can see on the left side of the tree. And at the top of that storyline is the original seed text, and then underneath are all the paragraphs that have been added below by various participants. 2 other features, you can see that there is a comment facility. Somebody has added a comment to one of the paragraphs, which you would click on to view in detail. At the bottom left, there is what we call an evaluation widget, where at the end of the exercise, each participant is asked to identify which storyline they think is most likely, least likely, most desirable, and least desirable. And also there is a search button above the tree structure, whereby if you type in a keyword like China, it would then show you which of the nodes in the tree diagram you'll find that keyword. And in the text on the right-hand side, it'll highlight all references to China. It'll also give you some numbers on the frequencies of the occurrence of that keyword. So that's basically the structure of the user interface. That's what you'll see. And just to put things in context, the exercise we're going to talk about today, I think, is the 14th exercise carried out so far. 13 previous exercises have involved participants ranging in number from 6 to 15. These have been students, volunteers, crowdsourced workers, staff of NGOs, and international experts. And the time frame that they've looked into the future has ranged from 2 to 10 years in increments of between 3 months to a year at a time. And the topics we've looked at when we've looked into the future have been US federal politics, UK politics relating to Brexit. We've had about 2 or 3 climate change focused exercises, one looking at COVID implications, and another one, which we talked about today, is about biotechnology research. We've also had some exercises looking at alternative histories, including looking at UNV volunteer experiences, the implementation of agricultural projects, and the implementation of gender policies in a UN agency. So when we look at the theories, the ParEvo site, we've effectively got 3 types of theories of change present. Each of those branches in that tree structure are individual storylines, and they describe the actions of particular actors, what they're doing in pursuit of particular outcomes. So we can see those storylines as theories of change in a narrative form. But the facilitator who organizes those exercises has objectives for the exercise as a whole, and for what he wants the participants to be able to do, and how he wants them to evaluate and use those that experience. So that's a second type of theory of change. And then thirdly, there's myself as the administrator who's running the whole platform, and I have a theory of change, which is to do with how I will accumulate data from multiple exercises and use this to optimize the experiences of individual facilitators. So with any theory of change, we would normally expect some sort of evaluation process. And when we're looking at the level of theories of change embodied in storylines, there's basically 2 opportunities where people will give their evaluations, where participants in particular. During the storyline development process, when participants decide which storyline to extend, they're making an evaluative judgment about what kind of storyline they would like to extend and what kind they would not. Also, they've got the opportunity of making comments on specific contributions, and that will often involve an evaluative judgment. But the main mechanism which we've used so far is during what we call the evaluation stage, when the iterations have come to an end. And as I've mentioned already, we've got a within application widget, evaluation widget can be used for quite simple questions. But it's also been almost always the case that the facilitator has used an online survey to ask much more detailed questions. And in the case of the exercise that Tom and Lara will be describing, they have also held group meetings and one-to-one interviews to get further information. So having those different ways of seeking data on people's experiences and views of the storylines, there is then a process of analyzing that data, and I'm going to give 3 examples of the sort of analysis that can be done, and Tom and Lara will go into a lot more detail. The first thing you can see here is a scatter plot showing the distribution of storylines according to their likelihood and desirability, and that data was gathered from that evaluation widget. We could also do similar scatter plots for other aspects, other attributes of storylines like equity and sustainability. So when we've got a scatter plot like this, there are a number of questions which I would encourage facilitators to ask themselves and ask the participants. Firstly, to focus on contested judgment. So at the bottom, you'll see these red nodes representing storylines where there was dispute over the desirability of those events. So that warrants investigation and discussion with the people involved. Secondly, it's worth asking about what parts of the scatter plot are empty. Where are the missing storylines which haven't yet been explored and which could be explored by further exercises. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, is to get people thinking about, okay, here are the different possible futures ranging in likelihood and desirability, but how are you going to respond to them in real life? And to encourage that discussion, we have this matrix here of 4 possible strategies relating to different parts of that quadrant. So with undesirable but likely events, storylines that fall into this category, we want people to think about how those storylines could be prevented from happening, but if they do happen, what sort of mitigation activities could be undertaken. For storylines describing things which are desirable but unlikely, we want people to be thinking about how could those storylines be enabled and how could the events be exploited even when they do happen. For storylines describing things which are undesirable and unlikely, at the very least, we want to monitor possible changes in their status, their desirability and likelihood status. And for storylines which are desirable and likely, the suggestion there is that those storylines should be compared with pre-existing plans and narrative and diagrammatic forms of theories of change, and to see to what extent do they harmonize with those, and where there might be needs for some updating and adjustment of those plans. The second type of analysis is a quantitative analysis, and Tom and Lara are going to be talking about this in more detail. But one type of qualitative analysis involves looking at the whole group of surviving storylines and trying to find key differences between them. And so on the left-hand side, we can see one key difference between all these storylines was between, in the case of Tom and Lara's exercise, one key difference was the extent to which the storylines were focused on international solutions to the governance of biotechnology risk versus focused on a USA-centered solution. And then when we looked at those storylines focusing on international solutions, we then asked the question again, what was the most significant difference within those? And here we saw the main difference there between where a single international solution was being sought and where there were competing international solutions. So reiterating this sort of process of inquiry leads us to create this basically a nested classification of the storylines in terms of the types of outcomes that had been achieved at the end of the storyline. The third example of analysis is looking at analysis of people's participation. And in this scatter plot, the nodes represent the different participants, and the y-axis is the social network measure called out degree. That's the extent to which I have added my contributions to other people's contributions, and the x-axis is called in degree, and that's the extent to which other people have added on to my contributions. And the sort of question to be asked here is, what is the ideal mix given the type of exercise and the purpose of the exercise is being undertaken? Is there an ideal mix? And to what extent do we want to accept people just building on their own, which is essentially what's happening on the bottom left corner? Or to what extent do we want to encourage people to really be building on each other's work, which is almost the opposite? That's in the top right-hand corner and described as bridging behavior. And a related question is, which I'm having to address with another exercise underway being planned at the moment, is how can we maximize collaborative behavior if we do want to see a lot of bridging behavior? So in summary, I think ParEvo is a great instrument for facilitating creative, and I mean creative through combinatorial forms of thinking about a diversity of possible futures. And one thing to note, a second thing to note is that when this exercise is underway, people clearly do enjoy taking part, and that's an important thing in its own right. And secondly, the process does generate a large amount of analyzable data, which you'll hear more about. I think ParEvo is especially useful for thinking about what can happen in complex settings where there are multiple actors, multiple objectives, and lots of interactions between these. I think it gives a lot more attention to how things change over time compared to static diagrammatic representations of theories of change, but I'm not suggesting we throw those out. I think we need multiple ways of representing theories of change, and I think ParEvo is just an extra tool that we can think about when we're trying to articulate our expectations of the future. Thank you.
Thank you,
James.
Rick, that was find some questions to go on.
I'm not getting very good audio at the moment.
No, I think James has got some technical issues. I think maybe we go on to Tom.
Wonderful. Fantastic. And you should now be able to see my screen. Thanks, Rick, again for that introduction. And as he stated, I'm going to go on to talk a little bit more about, in fact, a lot more about what actually occurred during the exercise we ran together, and offer some reflections on this firsthand as a tool for doing what we've stated there, as a tool to explore possible future pathways. In our case study, our exercise focused on the problem or the problem space of governing life sciences research, biological research. So I'm going to talk about what I'd hoped for ParEvo to be able to do, what results I hoped it might be able to generate, briefly about what happened and some of the content of the storylines, and then on to some reflections on whether ParEvo functioned well as a tool for exploring contested futures and complicated presents. So the problem space, Rick closed his talk there by noting ParEvo seems particularly well suited to complicated spaces, to areas where there might be multiple competing or collaborating theories of change, multiple objectives, and essentially lots of different moving parts. And I think it is more than fair to say that that characterizes the landscape of governing life sciences research. So it is complicated and multifaceted. The research itself takes place in a huge variety of settings across the whole world, and with a variety of different levels of potential hazard and harm. And there's a brief definition of biosecurity there, which I'll leave to be read on anyone who wants to read the slides when they're circulated. And what I've just tried to capture here really is that it's a complicated situation whereby most experts involved find, despite their best efforts, there's a good degree of frustration as towards an inability to make progress on certain elements. And there's a general characterization that our ability to govern and think critically about the opportunities and hazards of some of this work is not quite keeping pace with the technological development. That may or may not be true, but that's certainly a sentiment that is commonly held. So what did I want to do with this exercise? Well, firstly, create a process for a group of expert stakeholders to explore these problems and opportunities, to gain a better understanding of how an expert cohort see potential limits of what can and indeed what should be done, and what might be desirable and what would be undesirable. And also to hold this exercise as what I've termed here as an experiment in governance. So this is an opportunity for people to, I often dislike the term sandpit, but a kind of sandpit for people who are often tied into very serious conversations about how things might be done differently, to open up the space for them to think about how they may be done differently. And tied into that, to really explore and to highlight to this cohort and then to external cohorts the non-inevitability of particular future developments, to show that things can and may be different. Okay, so who were these participants? Well, as I mentioned already, they were experts. These people were established mid to late career professionals. They came from either policy or technical backgrounds, and they were generally US or UK citizens. It was a largely male group with 3 women, and their motivations for participation were often the experimental approach itself, the frustration and general kind of intrigue towards something that could shift things that I noted, and a desire in some ways to just try something different than they normally get an opportunity to do. I won't run through in great detail how the exercise works, as Rick's covered that, and I think Lara will reflect on it a little in her slides as well. But this is just some description of the seed story. Now, this is the first part of the story, that first node that you'll have seen on Rick's diagrams. So I won't read out the seed story there, but what we drove towards here was something that provided a catalyst event for some kind of changes to occur, or indeed some kind of changes to not occur, but was actually very open in terms of scale and possibilities. We gave some suggestion in there to the kinds of focus we would like. That would be either state or NGO or international actors, but we really left it as a prompt that was wide open, so that the participants, using their collated expertise and in collaboration with each other, could really decide where they wanted to go through the iterations of this. And now, if you keep Rick's earlier diagrams in mind that showed you how this exercise comes together as an evolutionary tree, what I wanted to show you here is something about how the participants contributed and interacted over time. So you can see the seed story on the leftmost node, and I've highlighted iteration 1 there just so you can see that this is moving across rather than down. But what you can see is a majority of green nodes, which basically shows at each of those iterations, someone chose to add on to a previous storyline that they had not created. So there's a lot of interaction there. It's also relatively stand out that there are some trajectories whereby a participant has stayed very much within their own storyline and added to their own storyline throughout. The red boxes, I think, are very interesting. They signal a contribution that spurred several spin-off contributions. Several iterations came out from that. So something within that might have really grabbed people and said, well, okay, I think this could happen next from this point. So what kind of storylines did we actually, what kind of content did we get within these storylines? Well, in broad sense, there was some back and forth. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the red boxed nodes characterize something that particularly seemed to grab our participants. But often we found if something big changed, if there seemed to be a large amount of progress in a particular element of this governance, that there was a tendency to sort of bring things back, to add a little bit of what the participants later described as realism, but so that might not really occur within that time scale. And similarly, if things got a little bit too static, someone would inject some energy. So that's a very interesting dynamic, I think. We had changes that were proposed very much through existing mechanisms. And in this field, that represents organizations like the Biological Weapons Convention. But we also had proposals for new and as yet just imaginary institutions. Excuse me. We found that storylines generally stayed within the realms of, I've called it the realms of possibility politically. So we didn't have any major political reimaginings of how states or organizations interact with each other, but we did have within that significant changes or proposals to how those arrangements might be rethought. And particularly of note was that the biggest consistent determinant throughout were exogenous shocks or factors that were outside of the conversation about governing life sciences. Now, to me, this is very interesting because we brought this cohort together because of their expertise on this topic. But we found throughout that they thought the biggest things likely to cause a change would be something that was kind of out with, and that might be a rise in international rivalries, or indeed a new disease emergence, or some other more fanciful things. So here's some examples. This is some of the content. So 64, you will see, was actually just highlighted on my previous slide in the red circle. Here I've highlighted, we had, with the red outline, there's an example of the kind of medical or technical scientific knowledge we got throughout. So discussion of the details of different types of viruses, either naturally occurring or man-made. We had state actors prominent throughout. And what we also had here is the existence of kind of concepts of how things might change. So I've highlighted that with whole of government biosafety and biosecurity systems. And particularly interesting in this contribution was we have two brand new organizations and institutions imagined. So this is something that the participants came up with as a new model for thinking about and doing the governance of biological research. And just to demonstrate the prominence of external events and shocks, here what we can see is in this storyline, a new novel coronavirus, which I think they've termed COVID-23, has emerged. It's alleged that it's been lab grown, which I hope we keep our discussion away from the good or badness of that as a supposition, but it's interesting within the storylines. And what we saw crucially was that this prompted a great deal of action at a number of levels. At broad level, what were the characteristics of these contributions? Well, we had subject matter expertise, as I've shown you in those previous slides, across a number of ranges, but we also had the kind of other baggage, the other social baggage that these experts were bringing in. These might be the assumptions of how well states could possibly cooperate with each other, assumptions about which kinds of states were the right kinds of states to lead these discussions, and by proxy, which weren't. I think it's very interesting in some of our follow-up discussions that in the interim period, we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has actually provided an interesting further reflection point on some of these assumptions and how they might function. What kinds of futures did we get? We talked about content. Well, in the futures, we had some that were characterized by a paradigm shift. So that would be a whole shift in our model of thinking about the problem and our model of presenting solutions for them. This would be coming up with brand new bodies or new heuristics for thinking about how we govern life sciences research and how different organizations collaborate with each other. What we had far more of, though, were incrementalist shifts within existing organizations or returns to prior organizations. So we might have had a storyline where something new was proposed, but then by the time we got to our final iteration and our full casting of the future, we'd have had a return back to, for example, the Biological Weapons Convention. As major themes, some of them are noted there, but the extra one I'll note again here is just geopolitics. And this was state rivalry or the influence of non-state actors on how life sciences research was governed in this exercise. So what did we do with our analysis? I'll skip through some of this relatively quickly because Rick has talked about some of it and I know Lara is going to talk more. But we did interaction analysis, which I've noted in an earlier slide. We had our likelihood desirability surveys. We did our hierarchical card sorts. And then actually a lot of our qualitative analysis was done through summarizing of entire storylines, developing content coding, text coding based on this inductive and interpretive process, and then refining that over time using interpretive analysis of the whole storyline and then text searching to make that robust within the entire content. So this is just a quick example of where our coding sits to date. We have, I think there's 12 key themes, and we actually have a number of sub-themes, but I won't stretch anyone's eyes that far, that we've got to by this point. And the illustration on the right just shows you, as a demonstration of the amount of data we got out of this exercise. I think we have a spreadsheet with 110 different acronyms and abbreviations that we've had to match up with reality. Here you can see another example of the hierarchical cloud sort. This is actually my one. I just wanted to note that again to show how we've got both kind of a bottom-up approach to coding individual levels of text and coming up with the analysis there, as well as these top-down measures, so we can get more thematic and high-level analysis. On the storyline likelihood and desirability, one thing that was very interesting was the range of different reasonings for choosing things. So some participants really focused on, well, this one was clearly the most positive because it was the safest future we arrived at. Nothing bad happened. Some really focused on the idea that, well, even though some bad stuff happened, we got some kind of window for institutional change and improvement. I'll leave the rest of that stuff there to be read when we distribute the slides, but the distribution there, I think, is what was really interesting to me at this stage. So was this useful for the people who took part? Well, I think so, is the short answer. We're still building on that. And we'll have more data on that as we continue with the interactions. But one thing we saw, for example, were that participants fed back that the futures they created were quite pessimistic. However, despite this, one thing that was very interesting is even within these overarchingly pessimistic futures, and I think that might be a fair characterization, we had a lot of possibility identified. We had gaps for change that may not have been apparent otherwise. And we had problems identified that, even though these weren't novel identifications, were shared in a really interesting way. So this has created a reference point whereby we can keep constructing and keep working on collaboratively versions of, well, how do we get there, or how do we present this? So we very much seen this exercise as part of a multi-stage and like multi-touch point interaction, both with this cohort and with external cohorts. I'm going to skip through this slide and leave that for Lara, but I just want to measure briefly against the objectives I laid out at the start. So create a process to explore problems and opportunities as identified by expert stakeholders. I'm really confident that ParEvo provided myself, Lara, and Rick in collaboration with a really good opportunity to do that. And I'm confident from our feedback that our participants felt the same. They reflected both on their own assumptions there and on those of their colleagues. Did we get a better understanding of how these expert stakeholders see the limit of what is possible and how, and desirable and why? I'm confident that we fulfilled a good proportion of that with this exercise. And I think we'll do more and more of that as we have these repeated touch points. Begin to understand how it can function as an experiment in governance and how it might shift attitudes. I think with begin being the leading word there, I'm confident that ParEvo worked well for that as well. I think it's provided, at the very least, a scaffolding which we can keep referring back to see how governance could be difficult, and to do variously forwardcasting and backcasting to see how either this group of expert stakeholders or other cohorts might try and either secure or prescribe the futures that we created there, and explore and highlight the non-inevitability of future developments. I think we can say it's done that in some ways with the possibilities identified, although some of the feedback from participants has suggested that they recreated the present problems time and again, despite their best efforts. Hopefully that's an interesting summary of the meat of the study we did, and I'm going to hand over to Lara now.
Thanks, Tom. Let me just get my screen shared. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is slightly different. So as much as we're interested in kind of exploring the content that comes, these features that come out of ParEvo, what I'm also interested in is understanding how ParEvo compares to other feature exploration tools. And at CSER, we use lots of different features exploration tools, and I'm interested in what actually works, what it's capable of doing, and how we can think about the impact of ParEvo. Okay. So it's about evaluating the effectiveness of ParEvo as a tool for features exploration. So what kind of features can it produce, and how do these compare to the features that are produced by other tools and mechanisms? How realistic and likely are these features? And what is the impact on participants for engaging in a ParEvo exercise? But also considering how we might be able to use ParEvo to explore possible features for other high impact, low probability risks that are covered under the topic of CSER, and the existential risk and global catastrophic risk. So just a little bit about our current features work at CSER. A lot of this was predominantly focused on horizon scanning. We have Dr. Luke Kemp, who runs a lot of our horizon scanning work, particularly in the field of biosecurity and biotechnology. So he had quite a seminal paper that came out in 2020 called the Bioengineering Horizons. That was a kind of top-level horizon scan of the emerging issues and challenges within bioengineering. It produced a list of around 10 potential areas of concern over the next 20-year period. And most recently, just last month, he's been working on consultancy with the World Health Organization to do a horizon scan of emerging issues for global public health. So Luke actually uses what we call the IDEA protocol, which is this kind of 4-stage, it's kind of similar to the steps of Adelphi, where you have these sessions of a discussion where people present ideas and then they go through a scoring and kind of setting, and then are rediscussed and then realigned into forming a kind of list of topics and concerns. Something else that we do at CSER that's a little bit different in features exploration is the use of role-playing games. And we have this game called Intelligence Rising that I've also been working on for the last couple of years. So Intelligence Rising is a strategic role-play game that's about exploring possible pathways and features within the development space of artificial intelligence. So people are encouraged to play. We have both a virtual and a tabletop version. And they're encouraged to embody an actor. So either a country, the president of a country, or the CEO of a tech development company like Alphabet or Tencent. And they work through round by round developing artificial intelligence technologies and releasing new products and services, with the end goal of reaching either artificial general intelligence or comprehensive AI services. But the point of this is very much around education, about teaching around the importance of ethics and safety within AI. And, you know, if people release these top level products without thinking about those, it destroys the world kind of thing. But also to kind of provide this like safe space to discuss and explore these features that we just don't have any understanding of right now. So that, yeah, we've been playing that with people in, leading developers in the AI space. We've done it with lots of students, mainly PhD, with the kind of theory of change that if you have some kind of intervention now, before they go off into these big tech companies, maybe we can focus them towards ethics and safety. Effective altruist groups and some corporate clients. But why are we interested in ParEvo? And similar to Intelligence Rising, ParEvo gives us this opportunity to do something creative when thinking about futures. And I think it's really a great way to kind of engage participants by using their own creativity. It's really applicable across a range of disciplines. You've heard from Rick, who described the way in which ParEvo has already been used. And as we cover many different risks and threats in existential and global catastrophic risks, so that's those real high-end, high-impact risks, but low probability, like pandemics, like nuclear war, these kind of things. ParEvo is applicable across many of those. Improved in participant engagement, we'll talk a little bit about that as I go through. But compared to other techniques that might take a little bit longer, ParEvo is much shorter to run and can have similar results. Participation is anonymous. People join and they don't know who the other people are, or they tend to guess, but they have no idea. But it also produces multiple feature pathways. So Intelligence Rising only produces one possible feature. We've seen from this ParEvo exercise that we've had multiple produced. It also enables us to evaluate not only the content that comes out of ParEvo, but also the process in which participants have gone through, and understanding what the intervention has actually achieved in terms of their personal impact. The thing that I love most about ParEvo is just the data output. And you've already seen lots of the examples of data, and I'm going to show you some more, but there's an awful lot of data that ParEvo produces. So in terms of the actual storylines and the content, you can look at the levels of interaction, which Thomas showed, between the participants, and even that kind of widget of ranking of storylines. So just to show you a different way of exploring the participant interactions between each other, this is like a network diagram where each blue node is a participant in the exercise. And the larger the node, the more contributions that person made. So there's a node down here that's quite small that you can see they made less contributions. So where there's a black line, that's a one-way contribution. So that person has contributed to another person's contribution iteration. And red is where it's reciprocal. So what you can see is that in the center, we have like a group of 3 that are regularly contributing to each other's storylines. And out here, we have an outlier who just seems to regularly contribute to just one other participant's storylines. So quite quickly, you can build up a picture of how that exercise has gone and how people have been reacting to each other's storylines. Something else quite magical about ParEvo is you can do these wonderful content network maps. So this one is about the actors and the kind of bodies that are mentioned within it. So these are all different countries, the EU, G7, China. But what's super useful about this is you can start to look at this and very quickly get an overview of what you might want to delve into in more qualitative or kind of follow-up evaluations. Why are these so interlinked in the center? What is the meat of that, and how can we kind of dig into that a little bit deeper? So my role has been really to understand what works here and how ParEvo works. So I adopted a mixed method approach to data collections. So we've had the widget that Rick has talked about in the least likely, most likely, least desirable, most desirable. And that was really an initial assessment by the participants on their initial reactions to each storyline. We also did a post-exercise survey. We had responses from 7 of the 11 participants, and that was really about understanding how people approach the exercise, but also thinking about impact and kind of reflections that they had of their participation. We did 2 focus groups as well, and this was the first time that the participants were revealed to each other. So, yeah, it wasn't too dramatic, but it was quite interesting to see how they, realized who else was involved. And this was more about delving into the content of the storylines and reflecting on their participation again. So we had 10 of the 11 participants attend those. And currently we're still going through the semi-structured interviews, one-to-one interviews with all the participants as we speak. So one of the questions that I ask in the survey is I ask the participants to rank out of 10 the level of realism that they perceive of the storylines and then the level of enjoyment. And the reason for kind of doing this, I'll kind of get to, but what you can see here is that quite simply, the higher that somebody perceives their level of realism in the storylines, the greater their level of enjoyment. So we had an average enjoyment of 6 out of 10, but actually you can see I mentioned that outlier earlier, and we do have an outlier in our data, and unfortunately there was a kind of a bit of a kind of issue with their participation in terms of their attitude towards some of the content. And you can see it's a significant outlier. So actually, when you remove that outlier, you get more towards 7.2 on the average. But when we actually compare this to, for example, another exercise, so intelligence rising, I've done a similar analysis, and you can see the same pattern. As people perceive the level of realism in the storylines and the features that are developed, the greater the level of enjoyment that they also have. And why is that significant? It's a fundamental of kind of game theory, is that the more that somebody is heavily engaged and interested in the subject and the topic that they're dealing with, and the level of realism, it means that you can tend to lead towards improved learning gains. So if your theory of change is about improving knowledge and understanding of a subject, you can generally tend to see a higher improvement in learning gains. But also if it's more towards getting attitude and behavioral change, it can be quite effective on that too. So this is already looking quite positive, that we're seeing this positive correlation. Other things that we asked on the survey, we asked people to say whether they felt that the storylines produced were either pessimistic or optimistic, and to kind of what extent. Nearly everyone said that the storylines were mostly pessimistic, or a mixture of both, rather than optimistic, which is not that surprising. I think whenever we kind of run these kind of future scenarios for including intelligence rising too, people tend to opt towards more dystopian than utopian futures. So I am not overly surprised by this as a finding. One of the differences between intelligence rising and ParEvo is in intelligence rising, they're asked to embody a character. But in ParEvo, they are being invited based on their expertise and being asked to apply their own expertise to these future scenarios. So what was really interesting is when I asked them to kind of reflect on how well they felt that they were able to get their expertise into the storylines. Most said that, yeah, it was either moderately to extremely well, they were able to achieve that, which is a real positive step that people says that the people were relevant and had a good kind of reflection on the content that was being produced. So this kind of analysis from both the focus groups and the surveys, and we were interested in understanding how people chose what storylines to iterate, and their kind of justifications for that. So kind of reflecting back on those graphs I showed you about the enjoyment and the realism, we had a couple that said, I only chose to iterate the storylines with the highest plausibility, or I eliminated those that I did not find credible or felt I could not add to. So it's actually kind of like a bias in the final storylines, is of course, because people felt that they only wanted to stick to plausible and possible futures, those that they felt were reaching to the realms of the ridiculous, they were likely ones that died. And so, yeah, you end up with a higher level of realism in the storylines that you produce. One participant said that they had self-imposed a rule that they could never contribute to their own storylines or a storyline that they contributed to in the last round, which I kind of loved. And somebody else as well said, basically that whenever a storyline felt too pessimistic, I would purposely go and write something very optimistic and trying to change that kind of narrative between the pessimism and the optimism. Delving into kind of what impact it has on participants, I think it's probably too early to kind of have a conclusion on this. We definitely need to dig into this a little bit further, a little bit further down the line, and having people reflect back. But very initial takes that when we asked people to reflect on potential impact on themselves, some participants said that it made them have a broader view of the subject area and that they needed to be more aware of what that was kind of about. Some people mentioned that it made them more aware of how their colleagues were thinking and acting on certain different subject areas. And this participant said nothing profound, but a good reminder of the range of stakeholders affected by risk governance, the inadequacy of current international fora, disruptive role of global politics, and low likelihood of breakthroughs in this area in any time soon, which I would say is fairly profound. Also, just to share this quote, which I really I loved, it's when asked on their kind of reflections on ParEvo, they said, it's a little bit more creative than the work we usually do, which is very analytical and kind of, boring. But overall, I would recommend this type of exercise. I could see it as utility across a lot of different kind of areas. So I'm a fan, and I'm definitely a fan as well. So just some early conclusions, because we're still working through the analysis of some of the data that we've collated, and there's an awful lot to still work through. How does it compare to other future adaptation tools? So the engagement is really high because we're engaging participants. So the entire exercise ran for just about 3 weeks, with participants producing a contribution every 48 hours. We had 80 out of 88 possible contributions during that time, and that includes Thanksgiving weekend, where we had US participants and issues with time zone, which actually we still managed to achieve that quite high level of contributions. The narratives are really rich and diverse. You've heard from Tom speaking about the difference in content and the range of content that's produced, which is just so wonderful. So yeah, you end with 11 future possible scenarios, and that was from 4 of the initial contributions made by the participants. Yeah, participants said that they opted mostly for pessimistic futures. As I said, not that surprising. Generally, we head towards dystopian rather than utopian. Participants said it widened their view on not only the field, but how their colleagues also thought about the field and prioritized the issues within that space. I think it is significantly simpler than other elicitation tools. I've put Delphi there for those that run Delphi's. And yeah, horizon scanning. So that World Health Organization one that I showed you earlier nearly took over a year because of the commitment that the participants need to give and losing participants over such a long period of time. ParEvo is much simpler and straightforward and runs much faster to achieve that. The data analysis can be quite challenging. We've shown you a lot of the data that we've gathered, and it's a narrative analysis, and each contribution is about 150 words. So we've got 80 times 150 words to read and analyze. The anonymity of the process is really wonderful. It enables participants to be able to explore their ideas and their potential futures in a safe environment, but with, like many said, that they felt they were able to contribute things that if it hadn't been blind, they might not have thought to contribute. So that not feeling judged about what you produce. It's a little bit difficult to manage in the conflicts. I mentioned our outlier in the process, but there's the tools that say that we used a very basic version of ParEvo without commentator on facilitator tools. And how do we use these? It might have been a little bit more straightforward. So there's a little bit of testing on how we can confront some of those things a little bit earlier in the process. So yeah, please do keep tuned, and hopefully we'll be producing a paper later this year on all the data on how well we think ParEvo works. But yeah, we're still in the heart of the analysis. So I hope that was useful for now. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you to our three speakers for really engaging presentations and all bang on time. I hope you can hear me clearly. If not, somebody else may have to jump in. We've got some questions beginning to flow in, so why don't we go straight to those. So Ian Goldman, you were quick on the mark. Maybe you've got some examples of storyline developed, or maybe you would like one elaborated from the example we've got. And also the issue of how do you select the participants? And I also noted the number there. You had 11, and you mentioned, Rick, 6 to 15. So obviously there's the selecting the participants, and also, you know, the Goldilocks question: too many or too few?
Why don't Tom and Lara explain how they chose the participants for this exercise, and then I can make a general comment about optimum numbers.
Thanks, Rick. And yeah, it's a really good question. So the process for selecting participants was relatively organic networking. So this is the field that I am at least notionally some form of expert in. It's where most of my work is. So via first-hand contacts and contacts of contacts, I worked through to identify initially a list of 20 potential participants, and had a pretty high success rate with approaches, to the point that I think I'd got to the point of having 4 I'm too busy or I'm not interested, and then we had our 11 participants. In fact, I do beg your pardon, we initially had 12, and then at the last minute we kind of lost one and decided to go ahead with 11. But they were identified on the basis of expertise and kind of career stage. So the general commonality was people that were at least what you describe as mid-career, and generally went for people who are very established, have been in there a long time. That was firstly for a practical consideration of getting what we often term like elite stakeholders or high-level stakeholders, but also wanting to explore what this community that have actually been putting their head up against these set of problems for a very long time said. I guess attached to that is the assumption that we think we might do something, though I'm not sure exactly what, in the coming months, that looks to compare what this cohort developed and thought with, I'll say a younger cohort, but I don't necessarily mean age, I just mean career stage. People who have had less opportunity to get jaded, and see whether actually that means that they identify more as possible, or perhaps it's less intuitive than that, and they have either similar or more sets of restraints on what can and should be done. I hope that's a good answer for you.
Lara, do you want to add any comment to that? Okay. So my comment will be about optimum numbers. There's basically 2 responses to this, which is a very interesting question. One is to look at the field of research on collective intelligence. What are the optimum numbers for groups of people to solve complex problems? And in a very crude summary, I think the indications are that the optimal numbers for groups to work effectively like this is around somewhere between 10 and 20. It's a very crude estimation. However, in real life, like I'm dealing with the planning of an exercise involving research participants in the United States, looking at uptake of their research, and there we've got a large number of research parties who will be involved in this process, and we could be dealing with up to 30 different people. And so I've got to think about how we're going to engage them in a realistic way. So I'm not going to explain the details of how I'm going to do that, but I am going to, in the chat box, put a link to a page on a supporting website where I specifically talk about the different ways of scaling up. And because there are quite a few different ways of engaging a larger than 10 to 15 group of people. So please have a look at that for ideas if you're interested in that.
If I can just quickly add one thing to my response, the other limit to our cohort was that it really represented the US and Northern Europe. And it's relatively clear that you would have a different set of possibilities and very different storylines had we recruited the cohort from different parts of the world.
Okay, so there are a few more questions. I see the questions are piling in now, so we'll have to try and see how many we can fit in, but including about how the outcomes might be affected by the diversity of the selection of the characteristics. Hilary Bauer also asks about pessimism and optimism. And do you think the pessimism reflects a general pessimism about the topic, about the background, or was related to the question? So if the world situation had been different, would it have changed? But I guess linked to that is also this issue of choosing the initial statement and how you pilot that, and whether you can, as it were, set the rabbit down a more pessimistic or a more optimistic line by the way you set it. And there was another question there about facilitating the process and how the facilitator can steer things in certain directions, not least by the choice of the opening question statement.
If I can make a general question on steering, the strategy that most facilitators have taken to date has been what I'd call boundary management, just pointing out the boundaries where you don't want people to go across, like we don't want humorous comments, we don't want abusive comments, but within that, letting people take the direction that they want. That's been the broad strategy. But if a facilitator wanted to engage with the storytelling process more actively, they can use the guidance which is given at the beginning of each iteration. They can then put in comments there. For example, they could act as an agent of the wider environment and say, since the last iteration, the president of X country has been deposed, and this has caused ... events to happen. So I'd like you to take that into account in the next contribution that you make. So that's one way that the facilitator could steer processes to some extent, and the other is by having comments by either the facilitator or other parties making comments on the different contributions, raising questions about what's been said in those contributions.
Thank you. We have an anonymous attendee asking about context in terms of organizations. Would it be useful in a non-profit? And I think the more general issue here is anonymity. And it was interesting that, what Lara was talking about was when identities were revealed and how that changes the way it can be used. I guess in other contexts, Rick, you might have done it without anonymity, or is that a standard part of the process?
I've only done it once without anonymity, and that was in a classroom setting. And I basically don't think it's a good idea because the whole idea is to get people to think about ideas independent of who owns those ideas. And I've heard accounts of strategic planning exercises which were in an NGO, which were more about a battle of personalities than a battle of ideas. So, I think the assumption of the benefit of anonymity is a pretty basic one in the design of this process. Lara, do you want to make comments about the reaction when you had the open meeting where everybody saw who was participating?
Yeah, I think it was quite interesting to see. Most of them, even then, still didn't know about each other or hadn't, worked together or collaborated. So they're still like, oh, okay, well, I was never going to guess some of these. But that is definitely something that we've seen, is that, and even as somebody else that reads these things without seeing who's written them, I always try to guess who's saying what based on their skill sets and things like that. So there's this level of anonymity, but still being able to attribute something to somebody by their known skill set. I can see in the chat that people were asking around the number of participants, but also covering the kind of spectrum of skills. For this activity, we have made sure that there is people from different ranges and walks of life. So we've got people that are within government, people that are within academic settings, and people that work within organizations that work on biosecurity. So we've got a range of people, but this one was very specifically targeted to elite level stakeholders within that field. So if you wanted to do something that covered people from a whole spectrum of backgrounds, so within an organization, if you wanted it right down from the volunteer level right up to the CEO, that's absolutely possible if you think that they can engage in the activity for the entire time. But that's why we have slightly less diversity in this activity. It's because, unfortunately, it's a result of a bias within the field. A lot of this thing is with existential and high impact risks, where we have slightly more male bias, but it's reflective of the field of biosecurity and biotechnology.
Thank you. Okay, so Nabil Hasnaki Amri asks about practical facilitation. Well, I think let's hold that question in our mind as we answer others. You've already mentioned some of the techniques, like ruling out certain kinds of answers. So if we can keep that question in our heads as we answer other questions. And then Dimitri Renmans is asking about how we use this kind of analysis to develop a program theory for a specific intervention, how we move from, as it were, I guess, the analysis to action. And Anne-Marie Gass is the same. How do we facilitate the shift from a future scenario through ParEvo to an actionable theory of change? So any thoughts on, from research and action to use?
I think, if I can just make a comment, I think there's two situations we're looking here. One is where an organization already has some sort of theory of change, and the other is where you're looking at a blank slate. I think where an organization already has a theory of change, if you think back to that matrix that I showed you of the 4 possible behavioral responses to different types of theories of change, the primary option there was to look at those desirable and likely storylines and compare them to your existing theory of change, and to identify where the existing theory of change in effect needs to be updated in the light of this new articulation of what a desirable future would look like. I think where there isn't an existing theory of change, the challenge then is to take those desirable and positive and likely storylines and convert them into a theory of change in a non-narrative form, which will often be in diagrammatic form. And you mentioned earlier about the work that Steve Powell and your colleagues have been doing with causal mapping. I think there is a possibility there, and my inclination would be to look at the actors that are involved in those storylines and to construct a diagrammatic theory of change, which was basically actor orientated. So the nodes in the theory of change, the diagrammatic theory of change, would be primarily be actors, and the connections, and there may be other nodes which would be events. But you would then have lines connecting them, which would be causal connections between them. I think this is interesting territory to explore, and I can't say I've got any more definitive ideas than that at this stage, but I think there's a distinct possibility there.
Okay. There was a question, another question from Hillary, which I glossed over, which was about conflict. And can you give an example of the conflict that occurred? You may or may not choose to do that. I'd like to link that to the fact that we've been discussing this as an example of scenario building in the future. And I haven't quite got my head around thinking how you would seed a story which was, moving back into the past. And trying to explain a past event. And of course, while you've been doing this, COVID has been raging. And so any thoughts on using this as a sort of evaluation tool as well, but also that conflict question?
I think Lara can take up the conflict question, and I can deal with the looking at the past, alternative histories.
Yeah, can do. So the conflict was really one participant who I think had tried to guess a lot of who the other participants were and kind of put models into their head of who these possible people were, and whether it was some level of personal gripe about these people that they perceived that it was or not, but basically it was around some of the content. So in some of the futures, there was a heavy narrative of this kind of geopolitical battle between China and the US. I guess slightly more pessimistic features on the Chinese side, and I think they were just like strongly opposed to some of the narratives that were being developed, and had quite an extreme view on them, which was unfortunate because it did affect that person's participation in both the exercise, which is what I think you see on that participant network diagram that made them into an outlier, because there was one person that they believed they trusted, and they only responded to that person's storylines that they perceived as that person's storylines. And then also, I think when they came into doing the post evaluations, specifically the survey, they were much better in the focus groups, actually were not at all, relatively fine in the focus groups. In the survey, I think decided to take out a little bit of that disappointment on there. And so some of the ratings and stuff, I think, are a little bit non-reflective. If I was to redo that survey with that person, I think in hindsight, they probably wouldn't respond the same.
Tom, do you want to comment on this?
I don't think I've really got anything particularly rich to add. Thanks, though, Rick.
I think I'll ask you at the end, Tom, for a final word, because we're all methodologists. This is, you're the person who was dealing with the substance of this issue. So, so we'll give you the final word, if that's all right. Rick.
Just in terms of looking at the past, we've had a couple of interesting examples of this, and they've all been within the context of evaluations. So one was an evaluation of UNV, the UNV system. And there, what happened was that the facilitator, the seed of the story, was an imagined person who was thinking about working with becoming a UNV. And from that seed, the participants, who were all UNV volunteers, UN volunteers, those volunteers then developed various storylines about what happened to this person when they subsequently became a UNV and during their period of employment. So these are all fictional accounts of what happened, yet they were part of an evaluation. So you might ask, what is the role of fiction in an evaluation? Well, what happened when they completed the iterations of this exercise? They then surveyed a huge number of UNV volunteers, and I think they got something in the neighborhood of 600 responses to their survey, and I don't know the total number, so I can't tell you what proportion that is, but it was quite high. They asked people to various questions about to what extent those storylines reflected their experience of being a UNV. And I think that gave the evaluation team a much richer picture of what it was like being a UNV that I think would be much more difficult if you just sat down and thought, well, we'll ask people a series of questions about what their experience was. You would be limited by your own imagination, whereas the storylines that have been constructed were collaborative exercises in the imagination of people who'd been in those jobs. So I think that was a really fascinating exercise. And there was another exercise similar to that, which was about the implementation of gender policy in a UN agency. And again, it was about a fictional person and their experiences, and some very, if I said just as an outsider, some very interesting sort of narratives that developed. And again, they surveyed people in that organization about what they thought about those various storylines. So that's one way of using alternative histories.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So a sort of a systematic way of seeding deliberation. I think that's really interesting. Okay. Bob Williams, I hope we've addressed already a little bit of your question about this being creative dialectics, including the tit-for-tat strategies that Lara mentioned. So as we've only got a few minutes left, let me kick it over to you, Tom, to give us some overall reflections.
Thank you, James. And let me just reiterate thanks on behalf of myself, Lara, and Rick to all our attendees today and to CDIL. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about this. I will, with that said, lean into my character as an outsider to this epistemic community and just offer some reflections on again, on how this really worked for me and what I see the value of it as. So I do a lot of work on the governance of life sciences research and on innovation policy generally, and a lot of work specifically on matters related to the Biological Weapons Convention. This is very serious and often in substance very dry stuff. We tend to we do a lot of work that is forecasting, we do a lot of work that is prediction. One thing that is only ever implicit in those models is that it's not just technical or objective process of prediction and foresight. There's actually a whole set of imagination. There's a whole set of assumption as to what is possible and what can and should be done there. And I think the richness of a tool like ParEvo is it's absolutely explicit about that. It's explicit that what we're doing is putting onto, well, digital paper, not paper, putting onto a website the bounds of what we think is possible to achieve and what would be desirable to achieve. And I think more so than that, we often laud, when we do take imagination seriously at all, we laud like this idea of a great thinker or a great imaginer. But actually, where most of our, arguably, I should say, where most of our big social change or big technical change often comes from is a shared or kind of collective process of imagining of what we either could or should do. Now that works at a whole macro scale, a whole social scale, albeit different people have different power to shape that imaginary. But again, ParEvo provides us with a really interesting tool through which to explore that collective process of thinking about what can and can't and what should and shouldn't be done. And I think with that, it provides a space to do some really interesting work in thinking about how we do the governance, do the rule setting, and do the norm setting for these things, which you often think of as very serious and very dry, and rightly so. It really is very serious, but it provides a space to think differently about how we might set those rules and those norms, rather than thinking purely in predictive or foresight terms.
Wow, that's yeah, that would, you should be on Thought for the Day, Tom. That's a fantastic way to end. I think it's great to have a, you know, a serious, wonderfully illustrated discussion of a social science research method, which ends up emphasizing the importance of imagination to solving real problems. And we haven't exactly cherry-picked a field in which one is normally, you know, can be imaginative and optimistic, even with, you know, hard, realistic, pessimistic scenarios. Imagination is critical to what we do. So I think that's a wonderful way to end, isn't it? And thank you to the questioners as well. We had a good selection of questions. I hope we did justice to them. And yeah, so certainly I'm a fan. I'm already thinking about how I might be able to use this in future scenarios. So thank you to Rick and to Lara and to